Hello everyone, and welcome back to another GIS lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to kick off a new discussion by talking about this concept called georeferencing. Right, georeferencing. And so georeferencing is largely an extension of this idea of projections and coordinate systems. Where georeferencing comes in is in cases where we have data that either does not have any projection, or maybe the projection is wrong, or there's just some other issue, right? And what georeferencing is going to do, as the name sort of implies, right? Georeferencing is going to reference something, reference a data set to the Earth, right? Geo. And so again, right, when we have data that doesn't have a projection on a coordinate system, or there's something wrong with that data's projection or coordinate system, it can often be helpful to take matters into our own hands and sort of provide it one by creating what's called a transformation that basically says, hey, any spot in this unprojected data, transform it to this spot so that it lines up with the real world. Okay, and I know this might seem confusing at first, but as we go through some examples and we look at things sort of in real time, this process is actually fairly straightforward conceptually. Right? But again, this idea of georeferencing is the idea that you can have data that doesn't have a spatial reference, or that has bad spatial referencing, right? Right? It takes data that lacks a spatial reference, or lacks a spatial reference. Right? And spatial reference in this case is talking about that coordinate system and projection, right? Coordinate system and projection. So it takes the data that lacks a spatial reference and matches it up with data that has a spatial reference. Right. So again, all georeferencing is doing is it's a method of taking data that we know is spatial, that doesn't necessarily meet the requirements for a computational GIS in terms of spatial referencing, and matches it up so that it can get a spatial reference based on another data set, right? Because we're referencing this data set that doesn't have something to a different geolocated data set that does. Okay. So I think it's easiest to think about this by looking at a real example. Right. So most of the time when we talk about georeferencing, it's generally talking about dealing with historical data or data coming from something like a CAD, where we know things are should be spatial, right? Historical maps, historical imagery, those should be spatial. Or CAD, for example, right? We know that CAD works with measurements and angles and things, so it should be spatial. But because CAD is not necessarily spatial enabled, you're not going to necessarily get a coordinate system out of it. And so what we have to do is we have to say, okay, we know that this should be spatial. Let's compare it to something that is spatial, match those two things up, and then simply take whatever the coordinate system is of the thing we know, and then apply it to the data set. So let's take a look at a real world example here. So this thing on the left, this on the left here, this is a high resolution ortho image. Right, so this is an ortho image. Right, this ortho image has a spatial reference. Right, this was collected with a sophisticated software and sensor system. So every single pixel in this image is where it would be, or really close to where it would be, if you were to go to that exact same location in the real world. Right. On the right-hand side here, we have a CAD sketch of Roosevelt Hall, which is a building that's on Farmingdale State College campus. And if you're observant, what you might notice here is that this building is the same as this building here, right? But this is a CAD sketch. So by default, right, this CAD sketch, right, this CAD sketch, right, this does not have a spatial reference. And so what georeferencing is going to try to do is it's going to try to transform this CAD sketch so that it matches up with this image, right? That's what georeferencing is. That's what georeferencing is going to try to accomplish. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a second, maybe pause the video, and just think through logically. If we wanted to make this CAD sketch match up with this image, how we might go about doing that. Okay, so hopefully you paused the video, hopefully you thought about it. It's okay if you didn't come up with 100% of the answer, but hopefully you have a rough idea of what you might try to do. And what we want to do is we want to say, okay, if we want to make this line up with this, the first thing we have to do is we have to find points that are in common. Right, so we can think of this as georeferencing steps. Right, the first thing that we're going to do to make this line up with that is going to be find common points. Right, and so for example, right, we may look at this and we may say, okay, well, I feel confident that this point right here, this edge of this little sort of arced protrusion right here, I might be confident in saying that this point right here would match up with this point right here. Right? I may feel confident in saying that, oh, you know, this protrusion right here right, is going to match up with this protrusion right here. Right? And I'm just literally picking 2 points, one in the thing we're trying to georeference, and the other in the actual data set that we know the location of. And I'm saying, hey, these are the same thing. Right? And we can do one more for good measure here, right? I might say that this point right here, right, is going to be this point right here, right? And again, so all I'm doing is trying to find common points in the data that we want to project and in the data that we know the location of. These common points have a special name. These common points are called either, you'll see them called two things. You'll see them sometimes called control points, or sometimes you'll see them called tie points. Right? And you can think of them as control points because they're going to control the rest of this process. Or you can call them tie points because you can think of them as tying this unprojected data set to this projected one. So the first step of georeferencing is to find control points. Again, things in the non-referenced data set that match up exactly to things in the referenced data set. Okay? So what we're going to talk about in the next video is the second step of georeferencing. So hopefully this made sense, and if you have any questions, as always, please reach out. Thank you.